Welcome to the channel. Love sci-fi? Subscribe, like, and share the journey. The crystal spires of Velthera Prime pierce the amber sky like frozen lightning, their surfaces reflecting the twin suns in prismatic cascades. Ambassador Marcus Webb stood at the observation deck of the orbital station, watching the planet below with practiced diplomatic calm. After 30 years of interstellar relations, he had learned to appreciate alien beauty while remaining vigilant for the thorns beneath the flowers. "The Velthari Council awaits your presence, Ambassador," announced his aide, Lieutenant Commander Torres. The younger man's expression carried barely concealed unease. "They've been insistent about the urgency of these negotiations." Webb nodded, straightening his formal diplomatic robes. The Velthari had requested this meeting after months of escalating tensions over mining rights in the contested Helix Nebula. 3 human colonies depended on those resources, but the Velthari claimed ancient territorial rights dating back millennia. It was the kind of dispute that could spark wars if handled poorly. The shuttle descent through Velthara's atmosphere was smooth, almost eerily so. The Velthari had cleared all civilian traffic, creating corridors of empty sky that felt more like a funeral procession than a diplomatic arrival. Webb noticed the unusual number of military vessels in orbit, sleek, predatory shapes that seemed to track their movement with predatory interest. The capital city of Nethys sprawled beneath them like a jeweled web, its bioluminescent architecture pulsing with rhythmic patterns that hurt human eyes to follow too closely. The Velthari had evolved from deep ocean creatures, and their aesthetic sensibilities remained firmly rooted in the abyss. Beauty and terror intertwined in ways that made humans instinctively uncomfortable. Webb's security detail, led by Major Kane, maintained formation as they disembarked. The humans were outnumbered 10 to 1 by Velthari guards, their crystalline armor gleaming with embedded weapon systems. Protocol demanded such displays, but something felt different. The usual ceremonial welcome was absent, replaced by an almost funeral silence. Prime Consul Vex Thon awaited them in the Hall of Currents, a vast chamber where bioluminescent patterns flowed across the walls like liquid starlight. The Velthari, leader's tentacles writhed in patterns Webb's cultural training identified as barely contained aggression. Behind him, the Council of Depths arranged themselves in a semicircle that looked more like a tribunal than a negotiating body. "Ambassador Webb." Vexthon's voice carried the harmonic overtones that made Velthari's speech sound like singing. "You come at a most auspicious time." Webb stepped forward, his diplomatic smile never wavering. "Prime Consul, I'm honored by your invitation. The United Terran Federation hopes we can resolve our differences through dialogue and mutual understanding." The Velthari leader's chromatophores shifted to deep purple, a color Webb's briefings had identified as contempt mixed with anticipation. "Understanding. Yes, we believe perfect understanding is about to be achieved." The hall's ambient lighting dimmed, and Webb felt his security team tense behind him. Major Kane's hand moved imperceptibly toward his sidearm, but Webb raised a subtle finger. Diplomatic protocol demanded they maintain composure, even when every instinct screamed danger. "The Helix Nebula has been sacred to our people for over 10,000 years, Vexthon continued, his tentacles weaving hypnotic patterns. "Your colonies desecrate graves that predate your species' discovery of fire. Such blasphemy cannot be overlooked." Webb kept his voice level, professional. "Prime Consul, our archaeological surveys found no evidence of Velthari presence in those systems. The Federation is always willing to discuss appropriate compensation for any cultural significance we may have overlooked." "Compensation?" The word rippled through the assembled council like a stone dropped in still water. "You speak of compensation for desecrating the resting place of our gods?" The lights died completely, plunging the hall into absolute darkness. Webb heard the distinctive whine of energy weapons charging, felt the shift in air pressure that meant they were surrounded. His security team's training kicked in, but their human eyes were useless in the perfect black that the Velthari called home. When the lights returned, they revealed a changed reality. Velthari warriors filled every entrance, their weapons trained on the human delegation. Vexthon's chromatophores now blazed with the deep red of judgment rendered. "Marcus Webb," the Prime Consul intoned, "by the ancient laws of the depths, you stand accused of crimes against the sacred. The penalty is death." The United Terran Federation Council chamber fell silent as the transmission ended. 700 delegates from across human space sat in stunned quiet, the weight of what they had witnessed settling over them like a shroud. The Velthari had broadcast Ambassador Webb's execution across every diplomatic channel, ensuring that humanity would witness their envoy's final moments. President Elena Vasquez stood at the central podium, her weathered face carved from stone. She had led humanity through the Proxima Crisis and the Tau Ceti Wars. But nothing had prepared her for this moment. The execution of a diplomatic envoy violated every treaty, every convention of civilized interaction between species. Madam President, Admiral Blake's voice cut through the silence like a blade. The head of Fleet Command looked older than his 60 years, gray hair reflecting the chamber's harsh lighting. The Velthari have crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. Ambassador Webb died under a flag of truce, in violation of every interstellar law. Defense Secretary Morrison nodded grimly. We have confirmation from our deep space monitoring stations. The Velthari broadcast the execution on all frequencies, ensuring maximum coverage. This wasn't just murder. It was a message. Vasquez activated the central display, showing a tactical map of human space. Red markers indicated Velthari fleet positions, their forces massing along the contested borders. Intelligence suggests this was planned. The execution was meant to provoke us into rash action, to give them justification for a preemptive strike. Foreign Minister Davidson, Webb's longtime colleague, spoke with barely controlled fury. Marcus was my friend for 30 years. He had 3 grandchildren, for God's sake. But if we respond with immediate force, we play into their hands. They want us angry, want us to make mistakes. Then what do you suggest? Asked General Reeves, her cybernetic eye gleaming as she processed tactical data streams. We can't let this stand. Every species in the galaxy is watching our response. Show weakness now, and we'll face similar provocations from every 2-bit empire with delusions of grandeur. President Vasquez raised her hand for silence. She had been elected for her ability to find solutions where others saw only problems, to chart courses through impossible situations. The execution of Ambassador Webb demanded a response that would satisfy humanity's need for justice, while avoiding the trap the Velthari had set. Activate Dark Protocol, she said quietly. The chamber erupted in shocked murmurs. Dark Protocol was humanity's most classified contingency plan, known only to the highest levels of government and military command. It had been designed for scenarios, exactly like this, when diplomacy failed and conventional warfare would play into enemy hands. Admiral Blake leaned forward. Madam President, Dark Protocol hasn't been fully tested. The psychological effects are exactly what we need, Vasquez interrupted. The Velthari believe they understand human nature. They think we're predictable, that we'll respond with righteous fury and overwhelming force. They're prepared for human anger. She paused, her eyes sweeping across the assembled delegates. They're not prepared for human darkness. Defense Secretary Morrison accessed his classified files, holographic displays materializing around the chamber. Dark Protocol involves complete information warfare, psychological operations designed to exploit alien neurochemistry, and the deployment of unconventional assets. The shadows, whispered Foreign Minister Davidson. You're talking about activating the shadows. Vasquez nodded. The shadows were humanity's ultimate black operations division, trained in techniques that pushed the boundaries of ethical warfare. They were ghosts, myths, legends whispered about in the darker corners of human space. Even their existence was classified at the highest levels. The Velthari executed Marcus Webb because they wanted to provoke a response, the president continued. They wanted humanity to come charging in with battleships blazing, confirming their propaganda about human aggression. Instead, we're going to show them what happens when humans stop playing by the rules. Admiral Blake's tactical display showed Velthari fleet positions, their defensive formations designed to counter human battle doctrine. Their entire strategy assumes we'll fight like humans have always fought, direct, honorable, following the conventions of warfare. But if we abandon those conventions, we become something they can't predict, can't counter, can't understand, General Reeves finished. The Velthari fear the dark depths of their own oceans. What will they do when we bring the darkness to them? President Vasquez activated the quantum communication array, sending encrypted signals to deep space assets whose existence was known only to herself and a handful of others. Across human space, shadows began to move, preparing for a war unlike any the galaxy had ever seen. "They killed our ambassador," she said softly. "They violated the most sacred principle of interstellar relations. They wanted to see what humanity becomes when pushed past the breaking point." Her smile was cold as the void between stars. "They're about to find out." The message reached every corner of human space within hours, traveling along quantum communication, networks that pulsed like digital nerves. It was simple, direct, and carried the weight of absolute authority. Dark protocol is active. All shadows report for deployment. On the industrial world of Hephaestus, Dr. Alex Chen received the signal, while working in his laboratory deep beneath the planet's surface. To most, he was a respected xenobiologist studying alien neural chemistry. To the few who knew the truth, he was one of humanity's most dangerous weapons, a man who understood how to turn alien biochemistry against itself. The vials in his laboratory contained compounds that could reduce a Velthari nervous system to jelly within minutes, their bioluminescent communication organs burning out in cascades of uncontrolled neural fire. He had spent years perfecting these weapons, hoping never to use them, but understanding that humanity's survival might one day depend on crossing lines that civilized species refuse to acknowledge. 3 sectors away, Captain Lisa Park received her orders aboard the stealth ship Nemesis. Her vessel was invisible to conventional sensors, its hull absorbing electromagnetic radiation like a hole in space. The ship's crew had been selected for psychological profiles that bordered on the sociopathic, men and women who could wage war without the burden of conventional morality. Park's mission was simple: infiltrate Velthari space and begin the systematic elimination of their military leadership. Not through open battle, but through methods that would leave the survivors questioning their own sanity. The Velthari would die in ways that made no sense, their bodies found in impossible locations with injuries that defied explanation. On Luna, in facilities buried beneath Mare Tranquillitatis, Commander Jake Rivera oversaw the final preparation of humanity's most classified weapon. The Nightmare Engine was a device that turned alien neurochemistry against itself, broadcasting signals that triggered primal terror responses in non-human nervous systems. The Velthari, with their deep ocean psychology, would be particularly susceptible to its effects. Rivera's team had tested the device on captured Velthari prisoners during the last border conflict, watching as proud warriors reduced themselves to quivering masses of terror in minutes. The testing had been classified at levels that made their files accessible only to the President herself. Now those experiments would serve their true purpose. Across human space, other shadows activated. Maria Santos prepared her psychological warfare protocols designed to exploit the specific cultural traumas of aquatic species. Her broadcasts would carry subliminal frequencies that triggered ancestral memories of predation, of being hunted in the darkest depths of ancient oceans. Tom Bradley and his team of cyber warfare specialists began their infiltration of Velthari communication networks. They would plant false orders, create phantom fleet movements, and gradually convince the enemy that their own forces were turning against them. Paranoia would spread through Velthari ranks like a virus, destroying military cohesion from within. The Velthari had expected humanity to respond with the fury of wounded animals. They had prepared for massive fleet engagements, for the kind of straightforward warfare that had characterized human conflicts for centuries. Their defensive positions were designed to counter human battle doctrine, their propaganda machines primed to paint humanity as the aggressor. Instead, the galaxy began to experience something unprecedented. Human warships vanished from their patrol routes, recalled to staging areas that existed only in classified files. The usual flow of human commerce slowed to a trickle, trade routes going dark as merchant vessels returned to port. To outside observers, it appeared that humanity was retreating, withdrawing from the galaxy in fear. The Velthari military celebrated what they saw as victory through intimidation. Their propaganda broadcasts proclaimed that the execution of Ambassador Webb had proven human weakness, that the aggressive species had been revealed as cowards when faced with true consequence. Prime Consul Vexthan addressed his people from the Hall of Currents, his chromatophores blazing with triumphant patterns. "The humans cower in their systems," he announced, his harmonic voice carrying across Velthari space. They speak of justice and honor, but when faced with the reality of consequences, they retreat like scavengers from the light. Let this be a lesson to all who would challenge the sovereignty of the depths. But in the depths of space, far from the trade routes and communication beacons, something else was moving. Ships that registered on no sensors, crews that officially didn't exist, weapons that violated every treaty humanity had ever signed. The shadows were deploying, carrying with them the accumulated darkness of human ingenuity turned toward a single purpose. The Velthari had wanted to see what humanity became when pushed beyond the breaking point. They had expected anger, expected the righteous fury of a wounded civilization. They had prepared for conventional war, for the kind of conflict that could be won through superior firepower and strategic positioning. They had not prepared for humanity to stop being human. The first sign that something had changed came 3 weeks after Ambassador Webb's execution. Commander Thex Rill of the Velthari Deep Patrol felt the wrongness before his instruments registered anything unusual. His bioluminescent patches flickered with unease as he monitored the outer system perimeter, watching for the human retaliation that intelligence insisted was imminent. "Sensors are clean," reported his navigation officer, tentacles weaving nervously through control interfaces. "No human vessels detected within 50 light hours of our position." Thex Rill's chromatophores pulsed with skeptical patterns. 3 decades of military service had taught him to trust instincts over instruments, and every instinct screamed that they were being watched. The void felt different, charged with a malevolent presence that made his ancient genes whisper warnings of deep-sea predators. "Increase sensor sensitivity," he ordered. "Run full-spectrum analysis on all background radiation." The results were normal. Too normal. Space was never perfectly empty, never completely silent. There should have been cosmic ray variations, quantum fluctuations, the standard electromagnetic noise of a living universe. Instead, their sensors showed a void that seemed almost artificially clean, as if something was actively suppressing the natural chaos of space. "Sir," his communications officer's voice carried the harmonic overtones of confusion. "I'm receiving fragmentary transmissions on multiple frequencies. They appear to be human?" Thex Rill's combat instincts engaged. "Put them through the speakers. All hands to battle stations." The sounds that emerged from the ship's communication system were unlike anything in the Veltari database of human transmissions. Instead of the crude binary code and electromagnetic signals that characterized human technology, these were organic. Whispers that seemed to come from the darkness between stars, voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization. "Can you isolate the source?" Thex Rill demanded, his crew's bioluminescent patches flickering in rapid fear patterns. "Negative, sir. The signals appear to be coming from everywhere. They're not transmitted through conventional means. It's as if space itself is speaking." The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Thex Rill's trained mind began to recognize patterns in the chaos, fragments of Velthari ancient language, words that should have been lost to history, phrases from the deep scriptures that only the most learned priests knew. Whoever was broadcasting these signals understood Velthari culture with terrifying intimacy. "How long until we reach the outer marker?" he asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. 17 hours at current velocity, sir." 17 hours. Thex Rill's chromatophores shifted to deep purple, the color of resigned fear. His crew was beginning to show signs of psychological distress, their bioluminescent patches flickering erratically as the whispers worked their way into Velthari nervous systems. Like poison. Across Velthari space, similar incidents were multiplying. Patrol ships reported instrument malfunctions that left them deaf and blind for crucial minutes. Communication arrays began broadcasting fragments of the ancient deep scripture, texts that described the primordial terrors that had hunted their ancestors in the crushing depths of Velthara's prehistoric oceans. On the fortress world of Kethmore, Garrison Commander Vex Kroll received reports of mass hallucinations among his troops. Soldiers claimed to see shadows moving in impossible ways, shapes that bent light around themselves like living black holes. The base's psychological officers were overwhelmed, their treatment protocols useless against symptoms that defied medical explanation. "The humans are using some form of psychic warfare," reported the chief medical officer, his tentacles writhing with barely controlled panic. Our soldiers are experiencing ancestral terror responses, as if their deepest genetic memories are being activated. Vex Kroll studied the tactical displays, searching for enemy positions that simply weren't there. Humans don't possess psychic abilities. Our intelligence is quite clear on this point. Then, how do you explain what's happening to our forces? Before Vex Kroll could respond, the base's lights flickered and died. Emergency power kicked in moments later, but something had changed. The shadows seemed deeper, more substantial, as if the darkness itself had gained weight and presence. Soldiers reported seeing human figures moving through the blackness. Figures that vanished when directly observed, but left behind traces of impossible geometry. The psychological impact spread like a contagion. Velthari forces began abandoning their positions, fleeing to deeper water and darker spaces where they felt safer. Military discipline collapsed as ancient fears overwhelmed rational thought. Command structures fractured as officers found themselves unable to explain or counter an enemy that seemed to exist partially outside normal spacetime. Prime Consul Vex Than demanded answers from his military advisors, but the responses were increasingly incoherent. Reports spoke of human vessels that existed in multiple locations simultaneously, of attacks that occurred before they were launched, of shadows that consumed light and left only terror in their wake. Our forces are reporting contact with human assets, Admiral Krexthon reported, his chromatophores flickering with patterns of confusion and dread. But these aren't the humans we've studied. They fight without honor, without conventional weapons. They use our own fears against us, turn our biology into a weapon. Vexthon's anger blazed in brilliant red patterns. Impossible. Humans are straightforward creatures. They attack directly, with overwhelming force. This is something else. But as reports continued to pour in from across Velthari space, a terrible realization began to dawn. The humans had not responded to Ambassador Webb's execution with the righteous fury their profiles suggested. Instead, they had become something else entirely, something that understood fear on a level that transcended species boundaries. The whispers in the dark were just the beginning. Dr. Alex Chen materialized from the shadows of the Velthari research station like a nightmare given form. His stealth suit bent light around his body, making him visible only as a subtle distortion in the air. The station's security systems had been compromised hours ago, their sensors feeding false data, while he moved through the facility like a ghost. The Velthari researchers never saw him coming. The first scientist, Dr. Vex Noth, was working late, in the biochemistry lab when Chen struck. A single injection of engineered neurotoxin sent the Velthari's bioluminescent patches into cascading failure, his nervous system overloading as synthetic compounds mimicked the effects of the deepest ocean predators. Chen watched clinically as his victim's chromatophores blazed through every color in the spectrum before burning out entirely. But killing wasn't the primary objective. Terror was. Chen carefully arranged the body in an impossible position. Suspended, in mid-air with no visible means of support, tentacles arranged in patterns that spoke of ancient Velthari death rituals, he left no evidence of his presence, no traces that conventional forensics could detect. When the body was discovered, it would appear that Dr. Vex Noth had somehow been killed by forces that defied physical law. Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out with surgical precision. Captain Lisa Park's team eliminated Velthari military leaders with methods that bordered on the supernatural. Admirals died in locked rooms with no signs of entry. Generals were found in impossible locations, their bodies bearing wounds that suggested attacks from creatures that existed only in Velthari mythology. The psychological impact was devastating. Velthari command structures began to collapse as officers refused to take positions of leadership. Military facilities were abandoned as soldiers fled to the safety of heavily populated areas. The proud warrior culture that had dominated the depths for millennia crumbled under the weight of primal fear. Commander Jake Rivera activated the Nightmare engine from his lunar facility, broadcasting signals that penetrated deep into Velthari space. The transmissions were carefully calibrated to exploit the specific neural architecture of aquatic species, triggering fear responses that bypassed rational thought entirely. On Velthera Prime, Entire city districts emptied as citizens fled to the deepest ocean trenches, seeking safety in the crushing darkness that had once been their species' greatest fear. The bioluminescent architecture of their cities flickered and died as power systems were abandoned, leaving only the eerie glow of emergency lighting to illuminate empty streets. Prime Consul Vex Thon found himself isolated in the Hall of Currents, his advisors too terrified to approach the capital. The few reports that reached him spoke of impossible occurrences: human ships that appeared and vanished without trace, soldiers who aged decades in minutes, command centers where time itself seemed to flow backward. "This is not war," he whispered to his remaining council members, his chromatophores flickering with patterns of defeat. "This is something else entirely. The humans have become something that should not exist." Maria Santos smiled coldly as she monitored the psychological breakdown from her command center. Her broadcasts had been perfectly calibrated, using frequencies that resonated with Velthari neural architecture like tuning forks struck against glass. The proud aquatic species was experiencing racial trauma on a scale that threatened their collective sanity. Her team had studied every aspect of Velthari psychology, mapping their cultural fears with scientific precision. The broadcasts didn't just frighten individual Velthari. They awakened genetic memories of prehistoric terrors, of the predators that had hunted their ancestors in the darkest depths of their homeworld's oceans. "Phase 1 is complete," she reported to President Vasquez through encrypted channels. "Velthari military cohesion has dropped below critical thresholds. Their fleet formations are dissolving as ships abandon their positions. We estimate complete psychological breakdown within 72 hours. Tom Bradley's cyber warfare team had infiltrated every level of Velthari communication networks, seeding them with false information that fed the growing paranoia. Military units received contradictory orders that sent them chasing phantom enemies. Supply lines collapsed as logistics officers fled their posts. The carefully organized war machine that had seemed so threatening weeks earlier was consuming itself from within. The beauty of Dark Protocol was its self-reinforcing nature. Each success generated more fear, which led to more irrational decisions, which created more opportunities for psychological manipulation. The Velthari were trapped in a feedback loop of terror that grew stronger with each passing hour. But the true genius of humanity's response lay in its restraint. No major military assets had been deployed. No massive fleet engagements had occurred. No civilian populations had been directly targeted. By every conventional measure, humanity was showing remarkable restraint in its response to Ambassador Webb's execution, yet the Velthari Empire was collapsing. Other species throughout the galaxy watched in fascination and horror as one of the major powers crumbled without a single major battle being fought. The implications were terrifying. If humanity could do this to the Velthari, what could they do to anyone who opposed them? The message was clear, though it was never spoken aloud. This is what happens when you cross lines that should never be crossed. This is what happens when you mistake human civilization for human nature. The Velthari had wanted to see what humanity became when pushed beyond the breaking point. They were discovering that the answer was something that transcended their understanding of warfare, of conflict, of reality itself. In the depths of space, the shadows continued their work, bringing darkness to a species that had forgotten why their ancestors feared the deep. President Vasquez stood before the assembled delegates of the Galactic Council, her expression carefully neutral as she faced the most powerful beings in known space. The council chamber orbited the neutral world of Concordia, its transparent walls offering a view of the swirling nebula that had served as a backdrop for countless diplomatic negotiations. Today, however, the usual atmosphere of cordial debate was replaced by an undercurrent of fear. "Madam President," began the Altarian representative, her crystalline form refracting the chamber's lights into prismatic patterns, "the Council demands an explanation for the incidents occurring in Velthari space. Our intelligence suggests human involvement." Vasquez smiled politely, her hands folded behind her back. "I'm afraid I don't understand your concern, Ambassador. Thex Null. The United Terran Federation has made no aggressive moves against the Velthari Empire. Our fleets remain within established borders. Our military is conducting routine training exercises. Perhaps you could be more specific about these alleged incidents?" The Corvin delegate, a massive insectoid whose compound eyes glittered with barely contained hostility, clicked his mandibles in agitation. Don't play innocent, human. Velthari military units are abandoning their positions en masse. Their entire command structure is collapsing. This level of psychological warfare violates every treaty in the Concordia Accords. Psychological warfare? Vasquez raised an eyebrow. Ambassador Krexvoth, I assure you that humanity has deployed no psychological weapons against the Velthari. We are strictly adhering to all treaties and conventions. If the Velthari are experiencing internal difficulties, perhaps that's a matter for their own government to address. The Zephyrian representative, a being of pure energy contained within a magnetic field matrix, pulsed with indignant frequencies. The Velthari Empire is on the verge of total collapse. Their military has effectively ceased to function. Ships are fleeing to the outer systems, command centers are being abandoned. You expect us to believe this is coincidence? Vasquez turned to face the energy being directly. Ambassador Flux 7, are you suggesting that the United Terran Federation has somehow managed to defeat one of the galaxy's major military powers without firing a single shot? That we've accomplished in weeks what conventional warfare might take years to achieve? I'm flattered by your assessment of human capabilities, but perhaps you're overestimating us. The chamber fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. Either humanity was telling the truth, in which case the Velthari Empire was collapsing due to internal weakness, or they were lying, and had somehow developed capabilities that made conventional military power irrelevant. Neither option was comforting to the assembled delegates. The execution of Ambassador Webb was a violation of every principle of interstellar law, Vasquez continued, her voice carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. The Velthari chose to murder a diplomatic envoy under a flag of truce. They broadcast his death across the galaxy as a message of intimidation. The Federation has shown remarkable restraint in our response. The Altarian representative's crystalline structure flickered with uncertain patterns. But surely you must respond to such provocation. The galaxy expects justice, Vasquez interrupted. And justice comes in many forms. The Federation believes in allowing consequences to unfold naturally. Perhaps the Velthari are simply experiencing the weight of their own choices. Deep in Velthari space, the collapse continued to accelerate. Prime Consul Vexthan had retreated to the deepest chambers of the planetary government complex, surrounded by the few advisors who hadn't fled to the outer systems. The reports reaching him painted a picture of complete systemic failure. The Tau 7th Fleet has abandoned the Kepler sector, reported his military aide, tentacles writhing with barely controlled panic. Admiral Krex Maul claims his crews are experiencing mass hallucinations. They've withdrawn to the Abyss Station and refused to emerge. Vexthan's chromatophores flickered with the deep purple of despair. The Abyss Station was the most heavily fortified facility in Velthari space, a massive complex built into the deepest ocean trench on their homeworld. If his military commanders were fleeing there, it meant they were seeking the most primitive safety their species knew, the crushing darkness of the deep. What about the third defense grid? Offline, sir. The technicians claim their equipment is malfunctioning, but our diagnostics show all systems functioning normally. It's as if they're seeing things that aren't there. The truth was more complex than simple hallucinations. The shadows had seeded Velthari space with quantum-entangled devices that existed partially outside normal space-time. They projected images and sounds that registered on Velthari senses, but left no trace on recording equipment. To outside observers, the Velthari appeared to be fleeing from nothing, but to the Velthari themselves, they were surrounded by horrors that defied explanation. Dr. Chen's biochemical weapons had evolved beyond simple toxins. His latest creations were airborne compounds that triggered specific neural pathways associated with ancestral memory. Velthari exposed to these agents began experiencing genetic memories of prehistoric predation, reliving millions of years of evolutionary terror in the space of minutes. The brilliance of the human response lay in its plausible deniability. Every effect could be explained as equipment malfunction, psychological breakdown, or simple coincidence. No direct evidence of human involvement existed, yet the pattern was too consistent, too precisely targeted to be accidental. Sir, his aide's voice dropped to a terrified whisper. There are reports of shadows moving through the deep waters. Our reconnaissance drones are detecting massive shapes that shouldn't exist, creatures that appear on sonar but cast no shadows. Vexthon closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his species' fate pressing down like the crushing depths of their homeworld's ocean trenches. The humans had not responded to his challenge with the fury he had expected. Instead, they had shown his people what true terror looked like. The Velthari had evolved from predators of the deep, had built their civilization on the principle of strength through intimidation. They had believed themselves masters of fear, had used their terrifying appearance and dark culture to cow lesser species for millennia. Now they were learning what it meant to be prey. In the Galactic Council chamber, President Vasquez concluded, her statement with quiet dignity. The Federation mourns the loss of Ambassador Webb and calls for a full investigation into the circumstances of his death. We remain committed to peaceful resolution of all disputes and hope that the current difficulties in Velthari space will be resolved soon. As she left the chamber, whispers followed in her wake. The other species were beginning to understand that humanity had revealed something fundamental about the nature of civilization and fear. The Velthari had believed that might made right, that terror was a tool to be wielded against the weak. They were discovering that some prey had evolved to become predators of predators. 6 months after Ambassador Webb's execution, the Velthari Empire formally surrendered. Not to human military forces. Those had never crossed into Velthari space. Not to superior firepower. Not a single shot had been fired in anger. They surrendered to the darkness that had consumed their civilization from within, to fears that had proven stronger than their proudest military traditions. Prime Consul Vexthon arrived at the neutral station Concordia aboard a small diplomatic vessel, his delegation consisting of only 3 advisors. The once mighty Velthari Empire had been reduced to a handful of populated worlds, their vast military scattered to the outer systems where they huddled in deep space installations, too terrified to emerge. President Vasquez waited for him in the same chamber where she had faced the Galactic Council's accusations months earlier. Her expression was carefully neutral, diplomatic, giving no hint of the satisfaction she felt at seeing justice finally served. Behind her stood Admiral Blake and Defense Secretary Morrison, their faces masks of professional courtesy. Prime Consul. Vasquez inclined her head slightly. I'm pleased you accepted our invitation to negotiate. Vexthon's chromatophores flickered with patterns of defeat and resignation. The proud warrior who had ordered Ambassador Webb's execution looked ancient, his tentacles moving with the tremors of a nervous system pushed beyond its limits. Madam President, I come to discuss terms. Terms. Vasquez raised an eyebrow. I'm not sure I understand. The Federation has made no demands, issued no ultimatums. We've simply been waiting. The word hung in the air like a blade. Waiting. While the Velthari Empire collapsed, while their military dissolved, while their civilization retreated into the deepest places they could find, humanity had simply waited. Watching. Patient as the grave. You know what you've done, Vexthon whispered, his harmonic voice breaking with exhaustion. The shadows that hunt us, the whispers in the deep places, the way our own biology turns against us. This is not natural. This is not right. Vasquez leaned forward slightly. Prime Consul, I'm afraid you're mistaken. The Federation has taken no aggressive action against your people. We've conducted no military operations in Velthari space. Our forces remain within our own borders. If your empire is experiencing difficulties, that's an internal matter. Internal? Vexthon's chromatophores blazed with desperate patterns. Our soldiers age decades in minutes. Our commanders see creatures that exist only in nightmare. Our technology fails in ways that defy physics. You have turned the very darkness against us. Vasquez's expression remained unchanged. That sounds deeply troubling, Prime Consul. Have you considered seeking medical assistance? Perhaps the stress of recent events has affected your people's psychological well-being. The casual dismissal hit harder than any military strike. Vexthon's advisors shifted nervously, their bioluminescent patches flickering with shame and terror. They had come here hoping to find some way to end their torment, but the humans were offering them nothing. No acknowledgement, no mercy, no recognition that a war had even been fought. What do you want? Vexthon finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Name your terms. Our surrender is complete. Our fleets are scattered. Our world's defenseless. Tell us what you require. President Vasquez stood and walked to the chamber's transparent wall, gazing out at the swirling nebula beyond. Prime Consul, you seem to be under the impression that we're at war. But we're not. War implies conflict between opposing forces. What you've experienced is simply consequence. She turned back to face the broken Velthari leader. You executed a diplomatic envoy. You violated the most sacred principle of interstellar relations. You broadcast that violation across the galaxy as a message of intimidation. The Federation took no action in response. We simply existed. If your empire has collapsed, perhaps you should examine the foundations it was built upon. Defense Secretary Morrison stepped forward, his expression professionally sympathetic. However, the Federation is not without compassion. We're prepared to offer humanitarian assistance to your people, food shipments to your outer colonies, medical supplies for those suffering from psychological distress. The offer of charity to a once proud empire was more devastating than any military defeat. Vexthon's tentacles writhed with patterns of absolute humiliation. The Velthari had been reduced from galactic power to objects of pity in the span of months. There is one small matter, Admiral Blake interjected casually. The contested territories in the Helix Nebula. Given your current difficulties, perhaps it would be best if those systems were placed under Federation protection. Temporarily, of course, until your government stabilizes. Vexthon nodded mutely. The mining rights that had sparked this entire crisis now seemed insignificant, compared to the survival of his species. Yes, of course, whatever you require. We require nothing, Vasquez corrected gently. We're simply offering to shoulder some of your administrative burden during this difficult time. The Federation believes in helping our neighbors. As the formal documents were signed, other species representatives watched from the gallery above. The message was clear to every delegate present. This is what happens when you cross certain lines. Not military conquest, not occupation, not the usual trappings of imperial expansion. Something far more terrifying. The complete psychological destruction of an enemy without firing a shot. The Corvin ambassador's compound eyes reflected the chamber's lights as he processed what he was witnessing. The insectoid species had been considering their own aggressive expansion, had viewed humanity as a potential obstacle to their ambitions. Now they were reconsidering every aspect of their strategic planning. The Altarian representative's crystalline form dimmed as she transmitted urgent reports back to her homeworld. The crystal-based species prided themselves on logical analysis, but the complete collapse of the Velthari Empire defied every model of interstellar conflict they possessed. In the depths of space, the shadows began their withdrawal. Dr. Chen's laboratory equipment was packed away, his biochemical weapons sealed in containers that would be buried in the deepest vaults of human space. Captain Park's stealth ships faded back into the black, their crews returning to lives of quiet anonymity. Commander Rivera powered down the Nightmare engine, its quantum transmitters going silent for the first time in months. The psychological weapons that had driven an empire to madness were locked away, their very existence classified at levels that made them accessible only to humanity's highest leaders. But the knowledge remained. The techniques had been perfected, the methods proven effective. Other species throughout the galaxy now understood that humanity possessed capabilities that transcended conventional warfare, that made traditional concepts of military power irrelevant. The full Velthari delegation departed Concordia aboard their small vessel, returning to a broken empire that would never recover from the trauma of the past months. Their species would survive, but they would never again threaten anyone. The very mention of human space would trigger ancestral terror responses that no amount of therapy could overcome. President Vasquez watched their ship disappear into hyperspace, then turned to her advisors. How many other species were monitoring these negotiations? All of them, Admiral Blake replied. Every major power in the galaxy had representatives here, openly or otherwise. The message has been delivered. Vasquez nodded with satisfaction. Good. Perhaps now we can focus on more constructive matters. I believe the Centauran Confederation has requested assistance with their agricultural crisis. As the human delegation prepared to depart, whispers spread throughout the galaxy's diplomatic networks. Humanity had revealed something fundamental about the nature of power, had demonstrated that there were forms of conflict that transcended physical warfare. They had shown that the most devastating weapon was not superior firepower, but superior understanding of fear itself. The execution of Ambassador Webb had been intended as a message, a demonstration that the Velthari Empire feared no one, respected no conventions, recognized no limits to their power. Instead, it had become the catalyst for their complete destruction, accomplished without a single human warship crossing their borders. In the deepest archives of human military intelligence, new files were created. Dark Protocol had proven successful beyond all expectations, but its very effectiveness made it too dangerous for casual use. The psychological weapons that had broken the Velthari would be reserved for only the most extreme circumstances, when the survival of humanity itself was at stake. But the galaxy now knew they existed. Every species that considered aggressive action against human interests would have to factor in the possibility that they might face not human anger, but something far worse, human creativity applied to the art of terror. The Velthari had wanted to see what humanity became when pushed beyond the breaking point. They had learned that the answer was something that existed beyond their comprehension, something that turned the darkness itself into a weapon. As humanity's ships departed Concordia and returned to their peaceful systems, the galaxy settled into a new equilibrium. Trade resumed, diplomatic relations normalized, and the usual business of interstellar civilization continued. But beneath the surface, a new understanding had taken root. There were lines that should never be crossed, principles that should never be violated. And somewhere in the darkness between the stars, shadows waited to remind anyone who forgot these simple truths that some prey had evolved into something that even predators feared. The age of human innocence was over. The age of human patience had begun. End of story.